Hello and welcome to this ORF book discussion. My name is Samir Patil and I'm a senior fellow with the ORF. Today we are discussing the book Crunch Time, Narendra Modi's National Security Crisis by Professor Sriram Chaulia, published recently by Rupa Publications. Dr. Chaulia is a professor and dean at the Jindal School of International Affairs. He is also a regular commentator on national and international security issues and has also a show on TV. In the book Crunch Time, Professor Chaulia has taken four national security crises, two each with Pakistan and China, and outlined and examined India's responses to them. These crises include the surgical strikes carried out in September 2016 after the Uri terrorist attack, India-China standoff at Doklam in 2017, airstrike at the Jaish-e-Mohammed facility at Balakot after the deadly suicide attack on the CRPF convoy in Letpura in Pulwama, and finally, the recent border standoff with the Chinese People's Liberation Army in Eastern Ladakh, which incidentally will be completing 2 years next month. A change in India's response to the two key national security challenges: cross border terrorism emanating from Pakistan and the border disagreements with China. India's firm response to these two challenges in recent years has definitely demonstrated a domestic and global perception of the country and changed perception of the country. And in a sense, this shows the important role played by the critical actors in the national security decision making. So, to discuss this timely book, today we have a stellar panel. Dr. Jyoti M. Pathania, who is the founding editor of online India Journal of Peace and Conflict Resolution, and my colleague Karthik Pumakanti, who is a fellow at the ORF Strategic Studies program. Welcome, everyone. So, let me first begin by calling on our author, Dr. Chaulia, to elaborate on the theme of the book and share his key arguments. I would request you to do so in the next 10 to 15 minutes. Over to you, Professor Chaulia.
Thank you, Samir. Thank you. Greetings. It's always an honor to be in panels organized by the Observer Research Foundation, which is, of course, one of the premier think tanks in India on foreign policy and national and regional security. I wrote this book, Crunch Time, in order to engage with Indians as well as people around the world about a perennial problem that we have been facing in this part of the world since the founding of our nation states. And this is, of course, the territorial disputes as well as ideological divisions, both with our northern neighbor China and with our western neighbor Pakistan. And the work, of course, is a very contemporary one. It's not so much based on what's happened since 1947 or 1949 when the PRC was founded, but rather on recent years under the prime ministership of Narendra Modi since 2014. And what I'm arguing centrally in the book, as Samir already mentioned, is that there is a transformation in India's strategic culture and strategic outlook in dealing with these perennial problems. Um, the solutions, of course, nobody has solutions in the sense there has been no real peace settlement either with Pakistan or China on many of the disputed territorial spaces. And of course, there is an antagonistic relationship that India has with both of these countries for a long time. So I'm not actually looking into the whole issue of peace processes or the future of the relationship between India and Pakistan on one hand and India and China on the other hand. Rather, the focus of the book is narrower. It's looking, as Samir said, looking at four crisis episodes as learning moments from which we can deduct what kind of Indian state is an operation. What kind of responses does this Indian state have in today's time when it is provoked, when it is aggressed, and when it is attacked? And how does this Indian state react, respond, and try to deter these provocations and incursions from its northern and western neighbors? And this, of course, goes to the core of the debate about what kind of strategic culture India has. One of the debates I pick up in the book is the one started by George Tanham almost more than 3 decades ago, claiming that India doesn't really have a strategic culture and that it's a cacophony of different approaches, and it's chaotic and doesn't have the ability to really marshal all its resources to be able to beat back advances and aggression by neighbors, the two adversarial neighbors. And also the whole unwillingness apparently to retaliate and to raise the costs of aggression by these two quote unquote perennial problem states. So what the book is arguing is that India's strategic culture and its image as a soft state have stuck for a long time. And what has changed under Modi, I'm saying, is that there's a shift away from this. India is no longer a soft state. India has found and is continuing to try to find means by which it can deter and raise the cost of aggression by China and Pakistan in ways that do not cross a certain unwanted threshold and lead to full scale war or even nuclear holocaust. So, short of that, what are the means available? What kind of statecraft has Modi government used, and what kind of doctrines has it adopted? There are two doctrines I talk about in this book. One is the doctrine of offensive defense, which is associated with our National Security Advisor, Mr. Ajit Doval, and the other is the doctrine of security first, which has been enunciated by many figures in the Modi government, but especially Dr. S. Jaishankar, India's External Affairs Minister, and Rajnath Singh, India's Defense Minister. All these doctrines are explained in the book, and I leave it to the reader. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. But what I'm saying is that the approach of the Indian state is different now. And I contrast it with the previous administrations, especially with the seminal moment of the 26/11 attacks in Mumbai, and why the Indian state at that time failed to perform what Dr. Jaishankar calls the dharma of the state, which is to protect its people and to conserve its territorial integrity. And why is it that India waffled and did not find the right means to be able to raise the costs of that extremely heinous terrorist attack, which is sponsored by and carried out by Pakistanis on India's commercial capital. So from there to now, I'm saying that there's been a change, and through the crisis episodes, Samir already mentioned it. 2016, the Pathankot Uri attacks, and then the surgical strikes by the Indian army inside Pakistani territory. The Doklam crisis at the conjunction of Bhutan, Chinese occupied Tibet, and India, and then the Pulwama suicide attack and the Balakot airstrike, and most recently the tit for tat that we have been doing with China over the eastern Ladakh Aksai Chin undemarcated border, and the counter-offensives that India took in order to extract concessions from China. So, what I'm arguing in all these crisis episodes is that this is a different India. This is an India that's more willing to use calibrated force against its external adversaries, and which is found some kind of a middle path to be able to raise the cost of aggression without it escalating out of control. So, India has called Pakistan's nuclear bluff under Modi. India has called China's so-called asymmetrical bluff. Because the Chinese say that in terms of overall capabilities, we are 4 or 5 times bigger than India, and therefore India cannot afford to challenge us. At least that is a thinking under Xi Jinping, who wants to impose his will on weaker and smaller neighbors across Asia. So, but but the book Crunch Time clearly shows that there need not be a parity in capabilities for India to hold its own against external adversaries in crisis. And it's never been the case that only an equality in capabilities is what matters. There's much more that matters: political will, political leadership, and also doctrines, the ones I was talking about, like offensive defense and security first. And also, under Modi government, we have tried to mobilize non-military means to apply pressure and put the ball back in the court of the adversaries. Um, the campaign to isolate Pakistan for its sponsorship of terrorism, the FATF process, all these, India has been very active in trying to put across its viewpoint to the international community and to get them on its side, or at least to understand that we have a right to retaliate and to raise the cost of Pakistani aggression. And likewise, with the Chinese, what we have tried to do, we have the infrastructure building on the Indian side of the LAC has been at a record pace in the Modi administration, and we have not blinked despite multiple Chinese complaints that our infrastructure building is unacceptable to them. And at the same time, we have not gone along with the Chinese designs to try and involve us more deeper into plurilateral processes to counter the West. And we instead said security first. So it's very important that we use these diplomatic means and also economic statecraft. I explained how we have tried to use economic statecraft to also inflict pain on those who attack India brazenly and who have been doing it like a habit. So, nonetheless, it's work in progress, and as we know, in fact, the 2020 crisis, which is described in chapter 4, which is called "Turning the Tables in Ladakh," this it continues, as Samir mentioned, and we still have points from which the Chinese have not restored the status quo ante. We have succeeded in pushing them at some points, but not all yet. So that something needs to be done, is still very much there. As far as this crisis goes, it's not closed yet. But nonetheless, overall, what I'm saying is that we have done enough signaling through our actions and through our conduct and through a changed and transformed and bolder approach to national security. To enough signaling has gone to make the Chinese and the Pakistanis think about what kind of state they are now facing. It's not the same as before, where they would assume that, well, the Indians will absorb the blows, they'll forget what happened, and then they will again come for some kind of a settlement or a peace process to restart. I think it's important that we approach this through the formula of peace through strength. And as I said, I have not gone into the whole issue of the settlements of the disputes. Rather, I'm looking at the state's preparedness, the Indian state's preparedness, and its willing and its political will and mobilization of all the resources on hand, economic, military, diplomatic, and also its domestic public opinion. And this is another aspect. I mean, most people tend to think of national security crisis as something to do with the external adversary, and that's of course right. It is a foreign policy issue. It's not an internal security issue like, say, like the Maoist insurgency. Right? Whatever China does or Pakistan to India is it's a foreign policy issue, but it's also about Indian society, Indian democracy, the electoral metrics within India, and how rulers perceive national security within the prism of electoral politics. And here I'm arguing that Modi has changed the expectations of the society, has taken it along in such a way through bolder and more riskier maneuvers vis-a-vis the adversaries, foreign adversaries, that people now naturally expect the Indian state to respond forcefully when it is when it has been violated by China or Pakistan. So I think this aspect of the nationalist mobilization within India and how the society now is not satisfied with a meek or a submissive response or even a non-response, which was the case with Manmohan Singh after the 26/11 attacks, and how the state really the public really wants the state to deliver some results in national security, and how the prime minister and his team have been able to mobilize this kind of constituency and tried to keep it going. Although it's a hard ask, because if you take the most recent crisis with the Chinese. For example, the boycott China movement, I talk about it. It was very strong after Galwan. It lasted for 6 to 8 months, and then slowly it fizzled out. So there's only so much a state can do, right? It also requires the social stakeholdership, and public opinion must stay with it in order to apply pressure on the external adversaries. So I cover a lot of these things, and at the end of the day, what I'm saying here is that when you have tough nuts to crack, you need bold leadership which is willing to take risks, and also leadership that is happy um, to marshal all the resources and to put together whatever capabilities we have and throw them at the adversary. Now, just one example, I'll conclude. I talk about in the book about how after the 2020 standoff with China, we have moved special forces and battle units from the LOC side to the LAC side. It's a kind of a internal reorganization force posture. We have, of course, also under Modi administration done major defense reforms, including the integration of the jointness of the armed forces, and we are moving towards theater command. We have established a CDS, Chief of Defense Staff, and I show that all these internal reorganizations are necessary to face these what I call national security states. Unfortunately, our two adversary neighbors, neither of them is really a democracy, and each of them is a national security state. India cannot be a national security state which is captured by a small military elite or by a deep state. It's a democracy with a lot of demands on the rulers for welfare and spending, and lots of projects for the society for 1.4 billion, almost 1.4 billion people. But on the other hand, the people also want security, and it's not just bread. And therefore, how well has the state performed? So this is really my report card on how Modi has performed on national security. It's of course a hot button topic for television channels and for polarized debates you often hear, where the opposition always screams that Modi surrendered and succumbed, and the ruling establishment always says that no, we've kept the honor of the country. I'm saying we have kept the honor of the country, but it's a work in progress. We cannot become a national security state ourselves. India cannot become a hard state like Israel to deal with its external adversaries. India is a aspiring great power and wants to be a permanent member of the Security Council. We have a lot of relationships to manage, but still we can get harder from being a soft state. So that's the process of this transformation I've described in crunch time, and happy to hear the panelists what they think of it. Thank you, Samir.
Thank you, Professor Chodia, for laying out those really interesting arguments. But before I turn to the panel, I just want to ask two questions following up on your opening comments. So one question that I have is that looking at these four crises that you have looked at, do you think there is, in a way, India has now laid out its red lines, if I can use that term, when looking at any national security challenge as such? And the second question is there a template of Indian response that we can draw from these from these four crises, or is there, or do you think there is some element of surprise which is there, in a sense that the fact that India can maintain ambiguity about what kind of response it will give to any of the terrorist attack, or for that matter the border confrontation, will in a sense add that element of surprise to the Indian response?
Yeah, thank you, Samir. I think red lines, yes, we have drawn these. I mean, it's quite clear, right? Like Dr. Jaishankar has repeatedly told the Chinese counterpart Wang Yi that until they restore the status quo ante of April-May 2020, there cannot be business as usual. What are we saying? And I say this in the introduction of the book. This is about Indian blood and Indian land, right? And we will not compromise on those. We cannot, because especially with the Chinese, because they are, they have got hegemonic intention to try and dominate this region. And if we concede this, the next thing is, if you give them an inch, they're going to ask for a yard and more, and they will look to permanently make India a subservient or a junior partner, which cannot be acceptable to a leading power or an aspiring leading power like India. So yes, we have drawn red lines, and we have clearly stated that some things are not acceptable to us. Prime Minister Modi directly told Xi Jinping during their informal summits, or even before that, and I go into detail analyzing those dramatic episodes of summit diplomacy, where he said that there are certain things the China has to respect India's sensitivities, and that's the bottom line. So yes, we have drawn some red lines, and we have communicated clearly that some things will not be tolerated, be it a terrorist attack or be it incursions, territorial incursions. Samir, your other question was about,
The template of response. Do you think, looking at this four crisis, we can
yeah,
draw
is
like
there
an
a
Indian
template?
template of response?
Yeah, well, I think we want to retain an element of surprise. I talk about many of the military operations that we carried out under Modi, and say that each of them was unique in its own way. So, in fact, Prime Minister himself alluded to that in 2019 after the Balakot airstrike, where he said that the Pakistanis were expecting us to do one more land-based surgical strike, but instead we went for the air option. So I think we have to maintain an element of surprise in order, and like our armed forces often say, that we have a right to retaliate at a time and a place of our choosing, because that's how you do what we call control the escalation metrics, and you stay on top of it, and you decide when this crisis is over for you, meaning I have settled my accounts, and I'm going to move in a different direction after making my point with the adversary. So I think we will want to maintain an element of strategic surprise, both with the Chinese and with the Pakistanis, and we need bargaining chips with them. This much is quite clear. We are not, like I said, we are dealing with national security states. Neither of them is a democracy. They've got very how do I put? They've got very strategically oriented elites who want certain things from India, and will go to any length to attain those things. So when we're dealing with these kind of hard nuts to crack, we have to have a lot of surprises. And I believe that through simulation and gaming, and both within the National Security Council and also outside from think tanks, we are now trying to develop a whole range of kinetic options that will be required, because like I said, these four are not the last crisis that Narendra Modi or India are going to be facing from China and Pakistan. This is a perennial problem. So we need to innovate and constantly have plans for operations. And of course, the contingency, the worst case scenario is full scale war, or even two front war, which we would never want really. But nonetheless, we do need to maintain that element of surprise, and that's the only way we can, I think, establish deterrence in the long run. Neither terrorist attacks from Pakistan nor attempted further incursions from China have stopped as a result of Modi's actions. But slowly but surely, like I'm saying, strategic culture takes time to make an impact on the adversaries. And takes iteration. So right now, I think there will have to be a few more rounds, unfortunately, of these kind of operations based on surprise, before the adversaries realize that it's better not to provoke the Indians anymore.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Chaulia, for laying out really the key arguments of the book. So now I call on Dr. Jyoti M. Patania to share her views and thoughts on the book. I would request you to speak for about 10 to 15 minutes. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much. I'm Dr. Jyoti M. Patania. I'm also a senior fellow at CLAWS, Center for Land Warfare Studies. Now, it was an interesting read, first of all, and 277 gripping pages, I must say, and actually a crunching time for me. It's I have just 10 points to make, and perhaps I'll just take 10 minutes, and that should satisfy the organizers. So first of all, the whole concept which we keep talking about in strategic circles is the concept of comprehensive security, national security. The comprehensive feel or the comprehensive nature of national security, which amalgamates all the levers, economic, diplomatic, as well as military. I think this was aptly brought about in the book. And so we are beginning to think in the academia as well as in practice about the whole concept of comprehensive national security, which we have just been hearing. But I think under the premiership of Prime Minister Modi, it has been put into actual practice to quite some extent. Second point, aptly summarized all four crises, as Professor Sriram had put it in his case studies, reflecting what? All four crisis response mechanism from India reflected the hard power approach of India, which he rightly brings out in his chapter. In fact, his sentence, one of his sentence, which I would like to quote, is very well pointed and carefully crafted terminology that he uses. And I would like to, just say that, rather repeat it. He says, shift from soft power, that is a state which is comfortable with its civilizational legacy of using, what I like when he uses the word calibrated hard power as a tool of statecraft. So it's not just hard power, it's calibrated hard power. So leaving it open ended, that, of our own choosing, if we want, we can respond in this manner. So I think that was very well written, Professor Sriram. I liked his well pointed and crafted sentences. Fourth, I just thought maybe, the whole concept of India's strategic culture. Now, this is something perhaps which I feel could have been elaborated, the theoretical aspects, because what is India's strategic culture? I'm still not sure about it, Though, of course, the concept of strategic culture was brought about by a Western political scientist, Jack Sinder, if I'm not wrong. But what what is India's strategic culture? We do not have a national security doctrine as of now, and we are talking about a strategic culture. I think one is a subset of the other. So maybe it's time that we start, gasping our breath and at least broadly talk about the contours of India's strategic culture. You know, within the gamut of India's national security doctrine. So I'm sure that perhaps will provide an additional value to your book. Now, chapter one, this is my fifth point: surgical strikes on fear. And I quote, Modi departed from strategic restraint and opted for hard retaliation with the ineptitude, quote unquote, ineptitude of the previous government. So, I don't know, as an academic, maybe this word sounds a little hard toned. Why I say that? I say that because each and every government which is in power would try to do the best for its national security. I'm sure you'd all agree with. There would hardly be any government in this world who will not think that it has acted to the best capability which it has at that point of time. So I was somehow little, I don't know, this is open for debate and discussion, but the word ineptitude perhaps sounded that the previous government was absolutely incapable, it didn't take some response. Yes, to some extent, perhaps, yes. But to call a ruling or a current government with that word, perhaps it's too hard hitting. So, as I said, the response mechanism of any government which is in power is for its security of its people. I don't think any of the government would try and do on the contrary. Number 6, interesting, gripping titles. I really liked your title of the chapters. They have same lettered words. For example, you have surgical strikes on fear, so SS. Then you have defiant in Doklam, which is chapter 2, so DD. Then you have 3Bs, chapter 3, breaking barriers in Balakot. Stupendous. Chapter 4, TT, turning the tables in Ladakh. So I really liked the way you kept your letters intact, with a little bit of simile, if I can use that word. So number 7, the book explains why leadership especially under leadership of Prime Minister Modi, how we have responded in a quick, in a tactical way, so which was good because the world saw a new India, as you rightly put it in your book. Um, but what are the critical determining factors of the new India? As you all know, the image of India outside has, of course, plummeted um thanks to our relationship with big powers. But what about the smaller powers, our neighbors? And if I'm not wrong, it is our prime minister's policy of first neighborhood, and I think that is where perhaps we need to do a bit of homework. We have to secure first our neighbors, and so 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 I think that is something which perhaps can also be alluded to. Of course, 277 pages is a lot of read, but a wonderful read. Next point, which is point eight, I think India's strategic culture, if I may just put it across, maybe one of the continuum in the so-called strategic culture of India, if we have one, is strategic autonomy. I think throughout, whether it was Nehruvian era, whether it is the Modi era, we have we have followed something known as strategic autonomy, which is our own sovereignty with regard to how and when we decide to respond to a particular neighborhood. So, point number nine, you mentioned about crisis management. Perhaps food for thought for your next book. Instead of managing the crisis, maybe we can finally resolve those crises because, ultimately it is the resolution of conflicts which ends, and no conflict ends in this world, but the conflict is transformed into a more habitable and more peaceful nature. And 10th, last point, the title is apt. It's actually a crunching title, and it adds on. It's an easy read also for people, who just perhaps are traveling, as well as a fantastic read for people who are academics, researchers, journalists. So I think in nutshell, it is it is a pretty easy read without stressing one's brain that you're getting into an academic book. So brilliantly written, brilliantly explained, and I think it's come at an absolute opportune time. So heartiest congratulations once again, and thank you, ORF, for having me on board. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Patania. And I think I certainly echo your point about the gripping language of the book in terms of the waterfront that it covers in terms of India's national security. And your point about the calibrated hard power approach, and the fact that there is and the fact that the approach of the previous governments, I think, in a sense, what I believe is that the view on the streets, at least, was that it, it had developed a sense of skepticism about India's response from the previous governments. And if I can say, there was a repetitive template of the Indian response to the persistent territorial violations of India, either the terrorist attacks or to the incursions of the Chinese PLA. We can certainly debate about those points. But now let me call upon my colleague Karthik to give his comments. Karthik?
But thank you very much for having me on board, and I want to thank Samir. I want to thank ORF as well, as I'm also a member of this institution. But most importantly, I want to be able to thank Mr. Dr. Professor Shriram Shaulia for for coming up with this very impressive book. I really enjoyed it. It was a fantastic read, and it's something that hasn't been done before. So in that sense, it certainly does bring something new to the table, and it also gives you a very good concise account of specific crises that have hit the Modi government and how Modi has tackled these crises. Every Indian government has faced crisis going back, let's say, even his two immediate predecessors. I'll just stop with them, with those two individuals. Manmohan Singh, and Vajpayee as well. I mean, they were also hit with crises such as in the case of Vajpayee, you had Kargil, you had the December 13th attacks, and then in the case of Manmohan Singh, you of course had the 26/11 attacks. And if you look at all these crises, we had varying degrees of responses, varying types of responses. Of course, the nature of the attacks and the nature of the belligerence also was very, very different. In some senses, we fought a real war, an active war, in 1999 against Pakistan, which Pakistan precipitated. But even there was a lot of restraint on the part of the Indian state. And so you see considerable continuity, if you note at least right up to Modi's arrival, in the kind of restraint that India has practiced. And ironically, it has also happened under BJP governments, under Vajpayee, but it also continued under Manmohan Singh. I have three specific points about what I think is very, very salient and very important as far as this book is concerned. Firstly, while the content is impressive and Professor Chaulia has mastered and marshaled a huge amount of evidence to show how the Modi government has tackled these specific crises during his tenure, whether they were to do with the surgical strikes in response to terrorist attacks, the Doklam crisis, the Pulwama attack, and then subsequent Balakot airstrike, and of course the more recent and the ongoing crisis with China along the border between India and China. But the most important thing is that my only concern is whether was Professor Chaulia's not drawing contrasts with previous dispensations, at least in terms of what they had articulated and what they wanted to do. And that could have been done better. And it could have also gone beyond the Manmohan Singh government, also gone back to Vajpayee at least. That is one area where I have a quibble. But the other thing is that he could have also drawn on some of the work done in previous governments. I mean, you look at non-alignment 2.0, for instance, which came out with a considerable amount exactly a decade ago. There was a lot of praise, a lot of controversy, there was a lot of criticism about that document. But there were certain specific recommendations made in that document which actually Modi ended up implementing. Whether he read it or not is a different matter, or whether people around him read it or not. But the fact of the matter is that these were prescriptions made by the previous National Security Advisory Board that was under the Manmohan Singh government, which had a specific team of people led by Shiv Shankar Menon and of course Ambassador Sham Saran. But they did recommend, pretty much carrying out surgical strikes, use of air power, and also not surgical strikes, but specifically air power in response to a Pakistani terrorist outrage. The other is also specifically to do with what China might do in anticipation, which is exactly what happened in Ladakh, and which we face currently, is the seizure of territory and India's response to that. How the Indian response could be uh, uh, could crystallize in the form of tactical escalation and force a quid quo pro, which is exactly what India achieved. If you remember, if you remember as Professor Chaulia has documented in his book, that India swapped territory that it had taken in August for the territory the Chinese had taken in Pangongso. So that sort of response and that sort of tactical strategy, is something that was also recommended in non-alignment 2.0. The point I want to make is that he could have drawn on some of that and also tried to contrast it with what the Modi government has done. While he does well in terms of fleshing out the political will that is so important in crisis situations, it is also important to draw attention to the fact that previous dispensations and the people who were part of it or also end up critiquing the Modi government when they shouldn't have been critiquing the government, because those were prescriptions they had made. And these were prescriptions that were actually implemented by the Modi government. And in that sense, the Modi government was also preserving consensus across the political spectrum in the country. In fact, Non-Alignment 2.0 had documented and was actually presented as a consensus document, that it reflected the foreign policy consensus in India. And unfortunately, many of the authors themselves never could quite come around to supporting the government when these specific episodes happened. And there was considerable flack the government drew for the Balakot airstrikes. There was considerable flack following even the actions taken to seize the Kailash range, for instance, which of course India swapped for China's not swapped actually, or withdrew from there in return for China's withdrawal from Pangan. So the point I'm trying to make is essentially that these were things that were recommended by non-alignment 2.0, which had partial and or considerable amount of support from within the government at that time. Uh, if not Manmohan Singh himself, it certainly received good amount of endorsement by his national security advisor, Shiv Shankar Menon. It evoked considerable commentary from a wide range of people, from academia to policy experts, and externally and internally. But it was most importantly built as a consensus document. What I think Professor Chaulia could have done is drawn attention to why these very individuals have ended up undermining some of that consensus in their criticisms also. And this is something that I fear in the long term. What if this government is out of power and we look beyond Modi? Can succeeding governments of another dispensation, maybe led by the Congress, or it may be a Kichdi coalition, or some prime minister from from the regional parties, say a Mamata Banerjee or Naveen Patnaik or Akhilesh Yadav, or whoever it is, who may emerge in addition to say even a Rahul Gandhi, how will they respond if they face the same crisis they face that Modi faced at following Pulwama or following Doklam or following the latest or the Ladakh crisis? How will they react? And I think this is something that that of course the book doesn't capture. It captures mostly what Modi did. But I think as a conclusion, I think what Professor Chaulia could have done is there are going to be challenges for succeeding governments to actually match Modi. Is Modi unique? Is he sui generis? Is he one of the few people who has come along and done things for a period of a decade or so, but his successors are unable to follow upon it? Ironically, there are criticisms even of that, but people who are actually supporters of the previous ruling dispensation and who are part of the NSAB from the previous dispensation, who say that no, now he's imposed a burden on his successors. They will be now expected to match him. So I think some of those issues could have been captured better and fleshed out better. Whether there's merit in that argument or not is a different matter. But generally, if you look at it, he has certainly pushed the goalposts. He has certainly shifted the yardstick. And he has done things that previous governments haven't done, even BJP led, particularly under Vajpayee. Vajpayee got a lot of plaudits, a lot of praise for his exercise of restraint at Kargil. He didn't cross the LOC. He won praise. Maybe it worked up to a point, and we could also perhaps cut him a bit of slack. But that is not true for the subsequent crisis when he mobilized in response to the terrorist strikes and then did nothing about it. In fact, the Pakistanis inferred a lot of weakness from India's non-response, and you can see a succession of attacks then that happened. And I think it set the stage for what Pakistan was to do subsequently. And I think that is one area that is one of the lacunas of this book. But otherwise, I do believe that most of what he has said, the way in which he has captured the essence of the way the Modi government has tackled these crises that it's faced, and over a stretch of so many years, and it has sent out a signal really to Pakistan and even to China that India is no pushover and India will respond. And even that is now visibly confirmed by even external actors powers. For instance, the Americans, I think about a month ago, not even a month ago, about 50 to 20 days ago, they did release, I think their Director of National Intelligence did release a report that India will respond in the event the Pakistanis indulge in the kind of provocations and the terrorist outrages they have, at least under the current dispensation. What happens under subsequent dispensations, a non-BJP dispensation, is a different matter. And we also have to see how BJP rulers themselves will respond. Will Amit Shah or Yogi Adityanath, if they are the logical successors to Modi, will they also act in the same way? Can't say, maybe. Likelihood is high, probability is high. But non-BJP dispensations, it's going to be a very, very tricky affair. And that is where the whole issue about force in our foreign policy, consensus around force in our foreign policy, needs to be better consolidated, because there are enough people out there who, even in response to attacks like what happened in Pulwama, are saying no council will stay. There is a lot. There is a fragment of opinion, foreign policy opinion, and strategic opinion in this country that does it. And so I think when you're looking at the larger issues about strategic culture and all that, the strategic culture that has shifted may have shifted only for a brief period of time. And that is my fear, and that is something that will have to be probed in the coming months and years. And perhaps Professor Chaulia himself could write another book about what challenges lie ahead. On that would be certainly an impressive and important contribution as well. But I'll stop here. I won't take it any further. If you want to have a further exchange or disagreement with what I've said or with others have said, then I would be welcome to hear that. And I'll stop here for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Karthik. In fact, what you said about the responses of the previous administrations and looking at the future sounds like two more book projects for Professor Chaulia. But let me now turn to Professor Chaulia himself to answer some of these points which have been raised by our eminent panelists. And I can't resist myself from asking two more questions to add to this thing. Uh, Professor Chaulia, one thing which I also wanted to know from you is that, and which I've mentioned briefly in the book, is the question of the national security reforms. You spoke about the creation of the post of the Chief of Defence Staff, but how do you view the reforms of the National Security Council system? Because with the appointment of the CDS, but also the reorganization of the National Security Council, I think those are, I think, the two most prominent reforms initiated by the Modi government in recent years. So, how do you look at those reforms, and how do you think they contribute to the national security management of India? And second question is, I mean, and Dr. Pratania did speak about the resolution, and you said that you don't want to talk about the resolution of the disputes. But again, looking at the current India-China border standoff, how do you think it is going to be resolved? Because it has dragged on for 2 years now, and we have had no direct contact between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Chinese President Xi Jinping. How do you think it is going to pan out in the near future? Over to you, Dr. Chau.
Thank you to both to Dr. Patania and Karthik. Actually, the thing is that I really wanted to document the change that has happened. So I was less focused on what happened prior to the Modi period. But I do mention the Operation Parakram, the mobilization that the Vajpayee government did for potential all-out war, um, or a punitive thrust inside Pakistani territory after the attack on the Indian Parliament in 2001. And I do mention there that it fizzled out because the mobilization took time. There was no element of surprise, and the Pakistanis also counter mobilized tens of thousands of troops on their side. And then, of course, the costs become so high for an all-out conventional or nuclear war that nothing could be done. So yes, previous governments grappled with crises, and uh, uh, well, they had their own brain's trust, but the brain's trust today is different. So my point is that none of them came up with the idea of offensive defense. It's Ajit Doval. The point is, and I talk about audience costs and how the audience costs in earlier eras before Modi were different. There was no electoral uh, advantage to be gained from being tough on national security. Uh, but Modi has changed the calculus. So going forward, and Karthik had asked about what will happen after Modi. I think that, I mean, the structural reforms, of course, are institutionalized. I mean, nobody can reverse CDS, the creation of chief of defense staff, for example, or the move towards theater commands. I don't think they can be reversed. So the core higher management of the military and the reorganization of all the forces to meet the existential challenge posed by China, especially. I think no matter who comes in, they are will be sufficiently abreast of the gravity of this constant hegemonic push for expansionism by China. And I talk in the chapter 4 of the book about Modi's famous speech in Ladakh after the Galwan clash, where he says that, expansionism is over and we are not going to tolerate or accept it. I think that's a benchmark. I think that's a line drawn which can no subsequent administration can backtrack from it, or start again becoming a soft state like we were in the past. Um, as to the other reforms, I mean, reform is a slow process in a democratic country. That's why I say in the book that India cannot become a national security state. This is, of course, the Pakistan is a national security state, and so is China. So short of that, it requires a lot of consensus building and compromise. As we know, even with the theater commands, there are a lot of differences within wings of the armed forces, the air force and the army in particular. So I think and it's a great loss that General Bipin Rawat is no more with us, because he was working so hard on, bringing all stakeholders on the same page. But nonetheless, I think nation security is a perennial problem, just as the threats are perennial from our two adversarial neighbors. So I think some institutionalization has happened. The border infrastructure, for example, now the Indian Army is saying that we are moving to a credible deterrence with Pakistan and punitive deterrence with punitive deterrence with Pakistan and credible deterrence with China. So those things, I think, doctrinal developments have happened and cannot be reversed. Uh, Core political will, mass mobilization, yes, it's a question mark. I do agree. Narendra Modi is an extraordinary politician. I mean, the kind of mass adulation and support that he has is unparalleled. I don't think even, I mean, not since Indira Gandhi have we had a prime minister like Modi. So to that extent, he's been able to take the nation along and to meet the external challenges. So yes, weak leadership. I mean, Karthik mentioned some of the contenders from the opposition. I hope India never falls into their hands, because I'm not so sanguine that they can maintain this strong political resolve of security first. You know, and the other thing I want to mention is one big shift under Modi has been a kind of almost nonchalance about the international reaction. Instead of worrying about, I mean, Shivashankar Menon and all of these people, I've referred to their justifications for the inaction after the 26/11 attacks under Manmohan Singh. Many of them were highly bothered and concerned about what will the world say and think, and how will that affect India or our image or our economy, right? And here you have India first, and here Modi is saying you have committed a brazen attack and you have to pay for it. That's it. And we don't care, frankly, or we'll try to manage the fallout of the international reaction. So that's a big difference. We want to mold the international opinion in our favor, not worry about it. So that's the big thing. I hope that the future leaders will think about it. The biggest point is about the future is, one day or the other there will be a post Modi India. Yeah, my hope is at least till 2029 he's here, leading the country. So what happens after that, I mean, it's really up to people of India to realize that one is democratic choice and change and all these things, the other is uh, the achievements and the shifts of the Modi era. If we don't consolidate them, if we don't let that continue, then we could be in trouble. And China, if the power gap with China does not close, they are surely going to take one more stab at us, or many more, especially China, because Pakistan is becoming weaker and weaker and mired in its own internal problems. But China is going the other way. It's zooming up. And I say in this book that the Chinese are waiting for the next opportunity to strike, especially when they think the US is weak, because their calculus about going after neighbors in Asia, harassing them or threatening them, is if the US is weak, if the US alliance system is weak, and if the US is mired in coronavirus or some other deep internal polarization, or Trump like era when they're withdrawing from all these places and becoming isolationist, then they believe their time is right for the to strike the, it's hot for to strike the iron. So it's that kind of China. And I talk about, the only point I would like to make is, with the non-alignment 2.0 and all those doctrines were in the pre-Xi Jinping period, right? At the time, you could still think about, being equidistant between the two great powers, China and the US. But Xi Jinping has made it very clear, right? He's going for maximum against the neighbors. He's not exercising restraint. So how do you deal with? I don't think non-alignment 2.0 is really a template going forward at all, simply because um, there are two great powers. One of the great powers does not have territorial claims on us, does not want to hem us down, does not want to contain India's rise, and the other one wants all those things. And Pakistan is part of that larger strategy to keep India bottled up in South Asia and to prevent its rise as a pan-Asian or Indo-Pacific or a global leading power. So I think we have now, the die is cast, and even if we settle the border, and Samir, to end with Samir's point, how will this crisis with the Chinese end? Quid pro quos, already we have done some. I think we may have to do more tactical maneuvers. The 14, 15 rounds of core commander level talks, several rounds of talks between the foreign ministers of the two sides, national security advisors, but no summit. That clearly shows the limit of this engagement. Why would Narendra Modi go to a summit, or a bilateral, especially a bilateral summit with Xi Jinping, unless they have restored the status quo ante? So I think what you should see what happened in Doklam. Of course, the Doklam was a very limited crisis, and this is a much bigger and much broader expansion is pushed by China. But what we did then, and I describe it in the chapter 2 of the book, which is defined in Doklam, that we used the BRICS card, we used Russia to our advantage. We convinced the Chinese that they had to step back, or else the BRICS and the RIC and all these processes will collapse. Prime Minister would not even go to the Xiamen summit of BRICS in China. And now, in a way, the wheel has come full circle, because the Chinese foreign minister wants Prime Minister Modi to physically attend the next BRICS summit, which is again going to happen in China. So we are going to play these cards, and they know it, and they know it's their global prestige is at stake. If they say that their rise is peaceful, they should demonstrate it with India, with Vietnam, with Philippines, with Indonesia, with Taiwan. So I think it's a bigger issue. How we settle with China depends a lot on whether the Chinese rethink their expansionist agenda under Xi Jinping, and at least pause, if not stop what they have been doing in the last 7, 8 years. So much depends on the US China equation. And I bring those factors in. This is not purely a book about bilateral between India versus Pakistan or India versus China. I'm trying to present a global picture also of the configuration of forces, and the alliances and the great power rivalries, and how India's tried to maximize, or as Dr. Jaishankar says, we have to exploit the fault lines at the global level. Unfortunately, this war in Ukraine has proven to be a totally unwarranted, unwanted for us, because we are being pushed into corners again to make choices. But ideally, we don't want to make choices, and we want to carry along a number of players with the sole objective of counterbalancing China. So I hope better times come as far as our choices go, and we have again more freedom to make choices. But the autonomy point that Jyoti ji was making is very important, and Modi government continues to stick to that principle or pillar, which of course existed in previous regimes also. But I think more so because now the autonomy is very central to our national security. That's why we've made very tough choices vis-a-vis Russia, despite the Ukraine war. So I think India first is the way to go forward, and to secure the nation, to secure the people of India. And Modi has done justice to his mandate and to his rhetoric. And it's not just been electoral gimmicks. I show, in fact, that there are many responses in this book that we took vis-a-vis China and Pakistan, which had no electoral benefits for Modi. In fact, the timing was not at all linked to elections. And still, they become part of the repertoire of a changing state or a changing strategic culture. And Jyotiji, yes, I do agree. Strategic culture, maybe I spent only 2-3 paragraphs on it. Maybe a few pages were needed for it as to what it is and how it's been changing. But we are changing, and I'm quite hopeful of that. Thank you.
Great. So with that, we have come to the end of this really interesting book discussion. Thank you, Dr. Chaudia, for your insightful comments, and I also want to thank the two eminent panelists who offered a particularly really insightful observations on the book. As Dr. Patania said, this book will attract a large readership because, in a sense, Pakistan and China continue to define not just India's national security choices, but also India's foreign policy trajectory. So I'm sure Dr. Chaudia's account of the four national security crises will be definitely useful for those who want to keenly examine India's national security behavior in recent years. So thank you all for joining. Thank you. Bye-bye.